The Twilight Warriors, the deadliest naval battle of World War II, and the men who fought it. By Robert Gandt. Narrated by John Pruden. Copyright 2010 by Robert Gandt. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Broadway Books, and imprint of Crown Publishing Group, a division of Random House, Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2010 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot. But he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Henry V to his troops on the eve of their victory at Agincourt, 1415, from Shakespeare, King Henry V. Many of these things I saw, and some of them I was. Virgil, the Aeneid. Timeline: 1944. June 17. At Saipan, Admirals King, Nimitz, Spruance discuss Okinawa as next major stepping stone. September 15. Air Group 10 reformed under Commander J.J. Hyland. October 23 through 26. Battle of Leyte Gulf. IJN suffers calamitous defeat. November 25. USS Intrepid severely damaged by 2 kamikazes off the Philippines. 1945. January 26. Spruance assumes command of U.S. 5th Fleet. Mitcher takes over Task Force 58. February 10. Vice Admiral Ugaki takes command of IJN 5th Air Fleet. February 19. U.S. Marines land on Iwo Jima. February 20. Intrepid deploys to join Task Force 58 at Okinawa. March 16. Iwo Jima declared secure. March 18. Air Group 10 flies combat missions against Japanese mainland. March 19. USS Franklin struck by Japanese dive bomber. March 26 through 29. U.S. 77th Infantry Division captures Karama Retto. April 1. Love Day. U.S. invasion of Okinawa begins. April 6 through 7. Kikusui No. 1. First massed kamikaze attack. April 7. IJN battleship Yamato and 5 escorts sunk by Task Force 58 aircraft. April 12 through 13. Kikusui No. 2. April 15 through 16. Kikusui No. 3. April 16 through 21. 77th Infantry Division captures Ieshima. April 18. Ernie Pyle killed on Ieshima. April 20. 6th Marine Division secures Motobu Peninsula. April 27 through 29. Kikusui No. 4. May 3 through 4. Kikusui No. 6. May 4 through 6. Japanese counterattack in southern Okinawa. May 10 through 11. Kikusui No. 6. May 11. Bunker Hill hit by 2 kamikazes, out of the war. May 23 through 25. Kikusui No. 7. May 17. Vice Admiral Turner relieved by Vice Admiral Harry Hill. May 27 through 29. Kikusui No. 8. May 30 through June 4. Japanese 32nd Army withdraws to southern positions on Okinawa. June 3 through 7. Kikusui No. 9. June 18. Lieutenant General Buckner killed on Okinawa. USMC Major General Geiger takes command. June 21 through 22. Kikusui No. 10. June 21. Lieutenant General Ushijima and Lieutenant General Cho commit ritual suicide. August 6. Atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. August 9. Atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. August 15. Cessation of hostilities in the Pacific. August 15. Vice Admiral Ugaki conducts last kamikaze mission. September 2. Japanese surrender aboard USS Missouri. Prologue. Alameda Naval Air Station, California, February 19, 1945. It was late, nearly 10 o'clock, but the party was going strong. You could hear them singing 100 yards down the street from the officers' club. I wanted wings till I got the goddamn things. Now I don't want 'em anymore. Getting plastered before deployment was a ritual in the wartime Navy, and the pilots of Bomber Fighting 10 were no exception. It was the night before their departure aboard the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid. The entire squadron had suited up in their dress blues and mustered in the club for their farewell bash. The party began like most such occasions. Pronouncements were made, senior officers recognized, lost comrades toasted. The liquor flowed, and then came the singing. It was a form of therapy. For the new pilots, the booze, bravado, and macho lyrics masked their anxieties about what lay ahead. For the veterans, the singing and the camaraderie brought reassurance. Most knew in their secret hearts that they'd been lucky. They'd lived through this much of the war. There were no guarantees they'd make it through the next round. Leaning against the bar and clutching his drink, Ensign Roy Eric Erickson bellowed out the verses of the song. Erickson was a gangly 22-year-old from Lincoln, Nebraska. He was one of the new pilots in the squadron. They called themselves Tail End Charlies. They flew at the tail end of formations, stood at the tail end of chow lines, and now were catching the tail end of the war. They'd spent the past year and a half training to be fighter pilots. Their greatest fear, they liked to boast, was that the war would be over before they got there. The tail end Charlies were seeing a new side to the squadron skipper, Lieutenant Commander William Rowie. Rowie liked to drink, and now that he'd had a few, he was leading his boys in his favorite drinking song, I Wanted Wings. They taught me how to fly, and they sent me here to die. I've had a belly full of war. Rowie had gotten a brief tour of combat duty in 1942, flying off the Enterprise in the early Pacific skirmishes. But then he was relegated to 2 tedious years as an instructor back in Florida. Finally, in the twilight of the war, he'd gotten a squadron command. Now Will Rowie was playing catch-up. But I'll take the dames while the rest go down in flames. I've no desire to be burned. Watching from across the room was the CAG, Air Group Commander, Commander John Hyland. A dozen years older than most of his pilots, Hyland wore the bemused expression of a father chaperoning teenagers. The only one near his age was Rowie, who had begun his commissioned career after a stint as an enlisted man. Hyland had seen lots of these parties, and he had nothing against them. It was a tradition. Let the boys get shit-faced, herd them back to the ship, then get on with the war. Though most of his pilots didn't know it, Hyland was also playing catch-up. When the war began, he was on a patrol wing staff in the Philippines. Since then, he had served in a succession of Washington staff jobs. Now Johnny Hyland, who had never flown fighters in combat, was another twilight warrior. The singing grew louder. Air combat's called romance, but you take an awful chance. I'm no fighter, I have learned. By the time they closed the bar a few minutes before midnight, the party had gotten rowdy. A drunk pilot had to be subdued after demonstrating how to smash the mirrors behind the bar. Another stuck his fist through a plaster wall. One of the junior officers nearly drowned when he passed out over the toilet. Several had to be hauled nearly comatose back to the ship and loaded aboard like cordwood. The Intrepid's departure the next morning was a hazy, indistinct memory for most of the tail-end Charlies. As the ship entered the heaving ocean, the hangovers magnified to bouts of barfing. Eric Erickson, who had never been aboard a vessel larger than a canoe, stayed sick for 3 days. After a week of provisioning and training in Hawaii, Intrepid was underway for the Western Pacific. In the smoke-filled ready room of Bomber Fighting 10, the pilots learned for the first time where they were going. The intelligence officer stuck a chart on the bulkhead. It was a map of southern Japan and the Ryukyu Island chain. The tail-end Charlies stared at the map. The men knew some of the place names, Shikoku, Kyushu, Okinawa. Until then, that was all they'd been, just names. Now reality was setting in. Those places on the map, the ones with the hard-to-pronounce names, were where they would see their first combat. But there was more. What none of them yet knew, not the pilots or the intelligence officers or the flag officers planning the operation, was that the island in the middle of the chain, the one called Okinawa, was where the Imperial Japanese Navy would make its last stand. Part 1. The Way of the Warrior. When reaching a stalemate, win with a technique the enemy does not expect. Miyamoto Musashi, legendary Japanese swordsman and military strategist, 1584 to 1645. My only hope is that the Japs don't quit before we have a chance to wipe 'em out. Admiral John S. McCain. 1. The Next Island. Saipan, June 17, 1944. The flies were everywhere. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance maintained his stone-faced silence as he waved the insects away from the table. They were large and black, and entire squadrons of them were swarming into the wardroom of Spruance's flagship, the cruiser Indianapolis. Indianapolis was anchored in the lagoon on the eastern shore of Saipan. The heavy tropical air was seeping like a dank cloud through the spaces of the non-air-conditioned warship. Spruance's guests were his two immediate bosses, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest King and the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Dinner had been served early in the hope that an ocean breeze might still be wafting through the portholes of the wardroom. Instead of a breeze, they got these damned flies. Splotches of perspiration were staining the Admiral's starched khakis as they waved at the insects. King and Nimitz had just completed a Pacific inspection tour. They had stopped to confer with Spruance, whose Fifth Fleet had just won a resounding victory at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Joining them in the wardroom was Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner, who had commanded the amphibious landings on Saipan. In keeping with wardroom tradition, the admirals were avoiding high-level military discussions at dinner. They were also avoiding the subject of the black flies and where they came from. King and Nimitz had taken a tour of Saipan that afternoon. Most of the island's 30,000 Japanese defenders and 22,000 civilians were dead, and their decomposing bodies had been moldering in the tropical heat for nearly a week. Saipan and the adjoining lagoon where Indianapolis was anchored were swarming with flies. Eager to be done with dinner and the flies, the admirals evacuated the wardroom and returned to the business of war. Spruance was aware that his actions in the recent Battle of the Philippine Sea had come under heavy criticism. Instead of dispatching Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's fast carrier force in an all-out attack on the Japanese task force, he had held them back to cover the landings on Saipan. By the end of the engagement, the air strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been crushed, 600 aircraft destroyed, and 3 carriers sunk. But in the view of many senior officers, it wasn't enough. Spruance had allowed the Japanese to escape with most of their fleet intact. It wasn't the first time Raymond Spruance had been accused of excessive caution, nor would it be the last. At the 1942 Battle of Midway, After his dive bombers had sunk 4 Japanese carriers, Spruance chose not to press his advantage and pursue the remainder of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's fleet after nightfall. The remnants of the Japanese force survived to fight another day. If Spruance was worried about his boss's judgment, he could relax. The Navy's senior officer put the subject to rest. "You did a damn good job there," he said. "No matter what other people tell you, your decision was correct." Coming from the hard-boiled Ernest King, it amounted to high praise. Few officers could have been more different in style and temperament than King and Spruance. Ernest King was tall, arrogant, fond of hard liquor and loose women. He was also a notorious bully who ruled the Navy with an iron fist. By contrast, Raymond Spruance was a cerebral, mild-mannered officer whose demeanor seldom changed. He was an oddity in the 1940s Navy, an officer who neither drank nor smoked, and in a generation that disdained exercise, he was a fitness fanatic. If his fellow officers didn't warm up to Ray Spruance's personality, they never doubted his brilliance. Even the arrogant King acknowledged that Spruance was the smartest officer in the Navy, though King put himself second. It was precisely because Spruance was so well regarded that King was aboard Indianapolis this evening, the flies notwithstanding. The conquest of the Marianas was complete. The decision had already been made that the island of Luzon in the Philippines was next. But then what? King wanted to know what Spruance thought should be the next objective in the ultimate conquest of Japan. Spruance answered without hesitation, "Okinawa." King's eyebrows rose. So did Nimitz's. It wasn't what they expected to hear. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, including King, were on record as favoring an invasion of Formosa. Why Okinawa? In his usual low-key monotone, Spruance laid out his case. Formosa was a heavily fortified mountainous island that would take months to capture. Bypassing Formosa and seizing Okinawa was the quickest way to strangle Japan. As a prelude to an Okinawa invasion, Spruance thought they first should take Iwo Jima, a volcanic island with an airfield that was within bomber range of Okinawa and Japan. After they'd captured Okinawa, they would be in position to blockade all shipping in the East China Sea. Japan would be cut off. It might preclude a bloody invasion of Japan itself. An uncomfortable silence fell over the flag compartment. King was dubious. So was Nimitz. Bypass Formosa? The admirals peered at the map on the bulkhead. Okinawa nestled like a protected pendant in the middle of the Ryukyu Island chain, dangerously close to the Japanese mainland. Even if Spruance was right, an invasion of Okinawa would be a hell of a battle. The Japanese would fight back with every weapon they had. Daylight was fading over Mabalacat Airfield, 50 miles from Manila, when the black limousine pulled up. The officer standing outside the command post snapped to attention. The fluttering yellow pennant on the front of the vehicle indicated an officer of flag rank. In unison, they saluted the short, stocky figure that emerged from the back of the limousine. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi looked older than his 53 years. He had the gnarled, deeply lined face of a man who had spent years at sea. Onishi was a complex man, known for his bluntness and coarse manners, as well as for his sensitivity. A product of his generation, he was an example of the classic samurai, a warrior capable of horrific deeds, who could also shed tears at the sight of a falling petal. Like many of his peers, Onishi was a poet who rendered in lyrical verse his deepest feelings about war and death. This day, October 19, 1944, was Onishi's first visit to Mabalacat. Gazing around, he saw that the place was a mess. The airfield was part of the sprawling complex of the formerly U.S.-owned Clark Air Base, and for the past few weeks, American carrier-based planes had been bombing on a daily schedule. Now, in the waning light, Onishi saw ground crewmen scurrying to conceal the surviving fighters in revetments, readying them for the next morning's missions. Onishi had arrived in the Philippines only 2 days before to take command of the First Air Fleet. The battle, the real battle for the Philippines, was about to begin. A powerful American invasion fleet was moving into the Leyte Gulf. Within a few days, U.S. troops would be swarming ashore. In response, the Japanese High Command had devised a complex counterthrust called Show 1. The plan called for coordinated attacks from the west by 3 separate heavy surface fleets and a decoying action by a carrier group in the northeast to draw away the American carrier task force. Show meant victory, and it reflected the delusional thinking of the High Command. Any victory in the coming battle would result more from divine intervention than from Japanese execution. Show 1 contained a fatal flaw. The battleships and cruisers of the Japanese fleet had only their own guns to fend off U.S. planes. Onishi's air fleet in the Philippines would be unable to provide any significant air cover for the Show operation. His squadrons had been decimated in almost daily attacks from U.S. forces, and the total inventory now amounted to fewer than 100 fighters. He'd been promised reinforcements from the Second Air Fleet in Formosa, but Onishi knew that was a pipe dream. The Formosa squadrons had just endured their own mauling, losing more than 500 airplanes in 3 days of attacks by American carrier-based planes. Knowing all this, it was hard for Admiral Onishi not to be discouraged. His meager air forces, his conventional air forces, had no chance of turning back the American carrier fleet. But now, in the twilight of Japan's dominion in the Pacific, Onishi's thoughts had turned to something unconventional. Japan had one remaining potent weapon, and it was as ancient as the Japanese culture. What Onishi had in mind was a special attack corps, a dedicated unit of airmen who would crash their bomb-laden airplanes into American ships. The desperate strategy had a name: Tokko. It was interchangeable with kamikaze and meant divine wind. According to legend, the name came from the wind god, who in the 13th century had sent a typhoon to destroy the invasion fleet of Kublai Khan. The divine wind had saved Japan. Tokko was an echo of the ancient Japanese code of Bushido, the way of the samurai. Already embedded in the Japanese military ethos was the idea that a warrior, especially one already wounded, was willing to sacrifice his life for the emperor. But the decision to die was expected to come in the heat of battle when all else failed. Deploying entire special attack units, Tokotai, on predetermined suicide missions was something new and controversial. To Onishi, it amounted to making the best of an impossible situation. The cream of Japan's experienced pilots had already been killed in combat. Most of the remaining young airmen were insufficiently trained and lacked superior aircraft and weapons. They faced almost certain annihilation in the coming weeks. The Tokko missions would allow them an honorable death while dealing a powerful blow to the enemy. Before Onishi departed Tokyo, he had obtained the blessing of the Minister of the Navy for a special attack force. What Onishi still didn't know was how the pilots would respond. The admiral kept an impassive face while he presented the idea to the squadron commanders of the 201st Air Group, the officers who would direct the Tokko missions. The officers stared back, showing no expression. Seconds ticked past. Finally, the Air Group executive officer broke the silence. He asked a staff officer how effective a plane carrying a standard 250-kilogram or 551-pound bomb might be if it crashed into a carrier's flight deck. The officer answered that the chances of scoring a hit were greater than by conventional bombing. No one was surprised. Conventional bombing against the American fleet had produced dismal results. Still, no one seemed happy about Onishi's Toko proposal. The executive officer asked for a few minutes to consider. He then went to his room and discussed the proposal with other pilots. Finally, he returned. The pilots, he reported, were enthusiastic about the Special Attack Unit. The executive officer asked only that he be allowed to organize the new unit. A feeling of relief swept over Onishi. The hard part was over. He had his first cadre of Toko warriors. A divine wind might still save Japan. 2. Tail End Charlies. Pasco Naval Air Station, Washington, September 1, 1943. Eric Erickson could feel the parachute thumping the back of his legs as he walked across the flight line. It was still a new feeling, and he liked it. This was the day he would make his first solo flight in the Stearman N-2S biplane, the trainer the Navy cadets called the Yellow Peril. Flying was the only thing the cadets liked about Pasco. The remote base was enclosed with a galvanized wire fence. There was nothing there but a few two-story barracks for the cadets and for the enlisted men who worked on the yellow-painted Stearmans. The town of Pasco had no bars, no entertainment, and worst of all, no available women. The closest real town was Yakima, a 2-hour bus ride away, but the cadets had learned that Yakima wasn't much of an improvement over Pasco. They were there to learn to fly, and that's what most, but not all, did at Pasco. Washing out of the program meant an end to the cadet status as an officer candidate. Washouts went back to the fleet as Seaman Second Class, the next to lowest enlisted rating in the Navy. Back in Nebraska, Erickson had been an aspiring artist. He was the son of hard-working parents who traced their roots to Sweden. His father was a foreman for the Iowa-Nebraska Light and Power Company, a veteran of World War I, and deeply suspicious of anyone who didn't earn a living by physical labor. That one of his sons actually wanted to paint pictures for a living disturbed him. The war changed everything. Erickson was studying art in a California academy when the wave of patriotic fervor swept America after the attack on Pearl Harbor. By the summer of 1943, he was marching with his fellow cadets on the parade ground of the Navy's pre-flight school in Northern California. Erickson was a tall, skinny kid, 6'2" and 160 pounds, lithe and agile enough to handle the strenuous physical training program. His previous college work gave him a leg up on the engineering and mathematics classes. Then came flight training. The former art student seemed an unlikely candidate to be a Navy fighter pilot. On every training flight, he became violently airsick. Each time they went aloft, he'd have to lean out and vomit over the side of the little Aranca training plane. Erickson's classmates gave him a nickname, Bucket. His job after every flight was to wash down the barf-stained fuselage of the Aranca. The airsickness continued until the day his instructor cleared him for his first solo flight. It was as though his guts experienced an epiphany. From that day on, he was finished with the bucket. By the time Erickson and his class got to the Yellow Perils at Pasco, flying had become great fun. There were close calls, but none were deadly. Engines sometimes failed. Once in a while, someone ground-looped, caught a wingtip on landing, and went swirling to a stop in a cloud of dirt, sagebrush, and torn fabric. Naval aviation, they believed, was not inherently dangerous. Sure, there were risks, but if you were good, really good, like they were, nothing bad would happen. Then, one day, one of Erickson's buddies, a fellow Nebraskan named Paul Hyland, was practicing a solo aerobatic routine. He inadvertently put the Yellow Peril into an inverted spin, a rotating, disorienting maneuver, and was unable to recover. The Stearman plunged into a wooded field near Pasco, scattering pieces of the wood and fabric biplane over the field like yellow confetti. Hyland was killed instantly. The accident stunned them all. They'd been together since pre-flight training school. Highland was a good-looking, well-liked kid who seemed blessed with above-average skills both on the ground and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?